On Christmas Eve, 1855, in Callaway County, Missouri, a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia picked up a meat cleaver from her master's kitchen and committed one of the most shocking acts of resistance in American slavery history. By dawn on Christmas morning, Robert Newsom and his 3 sons lay dead, their bodies brutally hacked by the woman they had tormented for 5 years. This is the true story of Celia's desperate fight for freedom, a story that would challenge everything America believed about slavery, womanhood, and justice. Before we dive into this powerful and disturbing chapter of American history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because understanding the full truth of our past is essential to understanding our present. December 1855. Missouri was a slave state teetering on the edge of civil war, where the institution of slavery was already fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. Callaway County lay in the heart of Missouri's tobacco and hemp-growing region, where enslaved people outnumbered free whites in many areas and where the brutality of bondage was masked by the veneer of Southern gentility. Celia had been the property of Robert Newsom since 1850, when she was just 14 years old. Newsom was a prosperous farmer in his 60s, a widower who owned a substantial farm worked by several enslaved people. To his neighbors, he appeared to be a respectable member of the community, a regular churchgoer who treated his property with what passed for kindness in a slave society. But behind the facade of respectability, Robert Newsom was a sexual predator who had purchased Celia not for her labor but for his personal pleasure. From the moment she arrived on his farm, Celia had been subjected to systematic rape and abuse that would continue for 5 brutal years. Celia's story began in 1850 when Robert Newsom's wife died, leaving him alone on his farm with his adult children. Rather than remarry, Newsom chose to purchase a teenage girl who would be completely under his control, with no legal protection and no recourse against whatever he chose to do to her. The purchase of Celia represented one of slavery's most horrific aspects, the complete commodification of human beings, particularly women and girls who could be bought specifically for sexual exploitation. Missouri law provided no protection for enslaved women against rape by their masters. Indeed, the legal system did not recognize that such a crime could even exist. For 5 years, Celia endured not only sexual abuse but also the psychological torture of bearing 2 children by her rapist while being forced to maintain the pretense of consent. She was trapped in a legal system that defined her as property rather than a person, with no rights that any white person was bound to respect. By 1855, Celia had formed a relationship with George, another enslaved person on the Newsom farm. George had threatened to end their relationship unless Celia could stop Newsom's sexual assaults, a demand that put Celia in an impossible position between the man she loved and the master who owned her body. The events that led to the Christmas Eve massacre began in the summer of 1855, when Celia became pregnant for the 3rd time by Robert Newsom. The pregnancy was difficult, and Celia was often ill, but Newsom showed no mercy in his continued sexual demands. Her requests that he leave her alone during her pregnancy were met with threats and increased violence. By December 1855, Celia had reached a breaking point. The combination of years of sexual abuse, the pressure from George to end Newsom's assaults, and her own desperate desire for some measure of control over her own body had pushed her beyond the limits of endurance. On December 23, 1855, Celia made a final appeal to Robert Newsom, begging him to leave her alone and allow her to recover from her difficult pregnancy. Newsom's response was to inform her that he would continue to use her as he pleased, regardless of her condition or her wishes. That evening, as Newsom's family prepared for Christmas celebrations, Celia made a decision that would change everything. She would no longer submit to rape. She would fight back, regardless of the consequences. What happened next was not a moment of spontaneous rage but a carefully planned act of resistance that demonstrated Celia's intelligence and determination. She understood that killing Robert Newsom would not end her problems. His sons would inherit her along with the rest of the property, and they had already shown signs of following their father's example in their treatment of enslaved women. Celia realized that her only chance of freedom lay in eliminating not just Robert Newsom but his entire family. It was a desperate calculation born of 5 years of abuse and the recognition that partial resistance would only lead to greater suffering. On Christmas Eve, as the Newsom family gathered for their holiday celebration, Celia quietly prepared for the most dangerous night of her life. She had access to the kitchen where the family's knives and cleavers were kept, and she knew the routine of the house well enough to plan her attack when the family would be most vulnerable. As December 24, 1855 turned into Christmas Eve night, Celia stood in the Newsom kitchen, holding a meat cleaver and facing a choice that would define the rest of her short life. She could continue to endure rape and abuse, hoping that somehow her situation might improve, or she could fight back with the knowledge that discovery would mean certain death. For 5 years, Celia had survived by submission and endurance. But on this Christmas Eve, she chose resistance. The most shocking act of slave rebellion in Missouri history was about to begin, and with it, a legal case that would force America to confront the brutal realities of slavery that most white Americans preferred to ignore. Christmas Eve, 1855, approximately 11 p.m. The Newsom household had settled into their evening routines after a day of holiday preparations. Robert Newsom's adult children, Virginia, William, and David, were staying in the main house for the Christmas celebration, along with their families. The house was full of white relatives and visitors, creating both opportunity and danger for what Celia planned to do. Celia waited until the house grew quiet, using her intimate knowledge of the family's routines to time her attack perfectly. Robert Newsom typically retired to his room around 11 p.m., and Celia knew she would have a brief window when he would be alone and vulnerable. She had hidden the meat cleaver under her apron as she moved through the house, performing her usual evening duties while steeling herself for what was to come. Years of abuse had taught her to mask her emotions and intentions, skills that now served her in planning the most dangerous act of her life. When Robert Newsom called for her to come to his room, a summons that had meant rape and humiliation for 5 years, Celia responded as she always had. But this time, she carried more than submission and fear. She carried the means of her liberation. Robert Newsom was lying in his bed when Celia entered his room, expecting the same submission he had demanded for 5 years. Instead, Celia produced the cleaver she had hidden and struck him in the head with all the strength born of years of rage and desperation. The first blow was not immediately fatal. Newsom cried out and tried to defend himself, but Celia continued her attack with methodical fury. She struck him repeatedly with the cleaver, each blow representing years of accumulated hatred for the man who had stolen her childhood and destroyed her life. The killing was brutal and personal, reflecting not just Celia's desire to escape, but her need to destroy the symbol of her oppression. Robert Newsom died slowly, understanding in his final moments that the girl he had treated as property had become his executioner. Celia stood over Newsom's body, covered in blood but feeling something she had not experienced in 5 years, the satisfaction of having fought back against her oppressor. But she knew that killing Robert Newsom was only the beginning of what she needed to do to secure her freedom. Celia understood that Robert Newsom's death would not end her abuse, it would only transfer her to new masters who might be even worse than their father. She had observed William and David Newsom's treatment of enslaved women, and knew that her situation would not improve under their ownership. Her only chance lay in eliminating the entire family, a calculation that demonstrated both her desperation and her intelligence. Celia cleaned the blood from the cleaver and prepared to continue her night of violence. William Newsom, the eldest son, was sleeping in a room near his father's. Celia entered his room as silently as she had entered his father's, using the same skills that had allowed her to move through the house undetected for years. William woke to find Celia standing over his bed with a bloody cleaver. His attempts to call for help were cut short by Celia's attack, which was even more ferocious than her assault on his father. She struck him repeatedly, ensuring that he would not survive to inherit her or seek revenge for his father's death. David Newsom presented a greater challenge because he was younger and stronger than his father and brother. When Celia entered his room, he was already awakening to sounds of struggle from elsewhere in the house. David tried to fight back, but Celia's fury and the advantage of surprise overcame his physical strength. The fight with David was longer and more violent, destroying furniture and creating noise that threatened to wake the entire household. Celia was wounded in the struggle, suffering cuts on her arms and hands, but she continued fighting with the desperation of someone who knew that failure meant death. David Newsom died from multiple cleaver wounds to his head and torso, his blood mixing with his father's and brother's in a house that had become a charnel house of retribution. Virginia Newsom, Robert's daughter, presented the most complex challenge for Celia. While Virginia had not directly abused her, she had been complicit in the system that enabled her father's crimes. More importantly, Virginia would inherit Celia along with the rest of the property, potentially continuing the cycle of abuse. Celia found Virginia in her room, awake and terrified by the sounds of violence that had echoed through the house. Virginia's pleas for mercy fell on ears that had heard 5 years of her own unanswered cries for help. The killing of Virginia was different from the others, less driven by personal rage and more by cold calculation. Celia understood that leaving any member of the Newsom family alive would mean her certain capture and execution. Virginia Newsom died from a single precise blow to the head, delivered by a woman who had learned that mercy was a luxury that enslaved people could not afford. The story of Celia's rebellion reveals the desperate measures that oppressed people will take when all other options are exhausted. If you're finding this historical account compelling, please give this video a thumbs up to help preserve these important stories about resistance and justice. By 2 a.m. on Christmas morning, 1855, four members of the Newsom family lay dead in their beds, killed by the 19-year-old woman they had treated as property for 5 years. Celia stood in the blood-soaked house, finally free from the sexual abuse that had defined her existence since she was 14 years old. But Celia understood that her freedom would be temporary. The murder of an entire white family by an enslaved person was unprecedented in Missouri history, and the response would be swift and merciless. She had perhaps hours before the bodies were discovered and the largest manhunt in Missouri history began. The most shocking act of slave resistance in American history was complete, but Celia's story was far from over. Her fight for freedom had only just begun. Christmas morning, 1855, 2:30 a.m. Celia stood in the bloodied Newsom house, faced with the immediate problem of what to do next. She had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of American slavery, the complete elimination of a master's family, but she understood that her victory would be temporary unless she could escape Missouri entirely. The bodies of Robert, William, David, and Virginia Newsom lay in their respective rooms, testimony to 5 years of accumulated rage finally finding expression. But Celia was practical enough to understand that sentiment and justice would count for nothing when white authorities discovered what had happened. Her first priority was to clean herself and destroy the evidence of her involvement. Celia washed the blood from her hands and changed her clothes, burning the blood-stained garments in the kitchen fire. She cleaned the cleaver and returned it to its usual place, hoping to delay the discovery of the murders for as long as possible. The other enslaved people on the Newsom farm presented both opportunity and danger. Some might help her escape, but others might betray her location to authorities, seeking to avoid collective punishment for the murders. Celia had given considerable thought to escape routes during the years of her bondage. Like many enslaved people, she had maintained mental maps of roads, rivers, and safe houses that might provide passage to freedom in the North or in Canada. Missouri's location made escape particularly challenging. Surrounded by slave states and territories, with limited access to free territory, Missouri was designed to contain its enslaved population. The Underground Railroad operated in Missouri, but networks were secretive and dangerous to contact. Celia's pregnancy complicated her escape plans significantly. She was in the final months of pregnancy with Robert Newsom's child, making rapid travel difficult and making her easily identifiable to pursuers. The bitter December weather added another layer of danger to any escape attempt. Despite these challenges, Celia understood that remaining on the Newsom farm meant certain death when the bodies were discovered. Her only chance lay in reaching the Missouri River and finding passage to Kansas territory, where anti-slavery forces might provide protection. Before dawn on Christmas morning, Celia left the Newsom farm for what she hoped would be the last time. She carried only essential supplies, food, warm clothing, and what little money she had been able to accumulate during her years of bondage. The first challenge was traversing the 15 miles between the Newsom farm and the Missouri River without being detected. Christmas morning provided both advantages and disadvantages. Fewer people would be traveling, but those who were abroad would be more likely to notice a pregnant black woman traveling alone. Celia used her knowledge of local geography to avoid main roads, traveling through forests and fields that she had explored during her limited free time on the plantation. The December cold was brutal, and her pregnancy made the journey exhausting, but she pushed forward with the knowledge that capture meant certain death. By Christmas afternoon, Celia had covered approximately 8 miles without detection. She was cold, hungry, and exhausted, but she had proven to herself that escape was possible. The Missouri River was still 7 miles away, and she would need to find shelter and rest before attempting the next stage of her journey. The bodies of the Newsom family were discovered on Christmas afternoon when relatives arrived for holiday dinner and found the house eerily quiet. The discovery of 4 brutally murdered family members sent shockwaves throughout Callaway County and triggered the largest manhunt in Missouri history. Sheriff William Jones immediately organized search parties to scour the countryside for the killer or killers. The systematic nature of the murders and the lack of robbery suggested that this was not the work of common criminals, but something far more dangerous to the social order. Initial suspicion fell on the enslaved population of the Newsom farm. When authorities discovered that Celia was missing, she immediately became the primary suspect in what newspapers would call the most shocking crime in Missouri history. Word of the murders spread rapidly throughout the county, carried by riders who warned white families to arm themselves against what might be a general slave uprising. The fear that had always lurked beneath the surface of slave society now erupted into panic. By December 26, more than 200 armed white men were searching for Celia throughout Callaway County and neighboring areas. Rewards totaling $500, an enormous sum for the time, were offered for her capture, dead or alive. The manhunt was characterized by extraordinary brutality against the entire black population of the region. Enslaved people were interrogated under torture, and several free black residents were beaten or killed on suspicion of helping Celia escape. Search parties used bloodhounds to track Celia's scent from the Newsom farm toward the Missouri River. The dogs picked up her trail easily, forcing Celia to abandon her original escape route and seek alternative paths to freedom. The intensity of the pursuit reflected white fears about the implications of Celia's crime. If an enslaved woman could successfully murder an entire white family, the foundation of the slave system itself was threatened. Celia had to be captured not just to punish her crime, but to restore white confidence in their ability to control their human property. On December 27, exhausted and with bloodhounds closing in, Celia sought refuge in a cave along Avoz Creek, approximately 5 miles from the Missouri River. The cave provided shelter from the December cold and concealment from the search parties that were systematically combing the area. Celia understood that her escape attempt was failing. Her pregnancy made rapid travel impossible. The winter weather was sapping her strength, and the massive manhunt made movement increasingly dangerous. She would need to make a final desperate gambit if she hoped to avoid capture. From her hiding place, Celia could hear the baying of bloodhounds in the distance, growing closer each hour. The sounds of her pursuers served as a constant reminder that her brief taste of freedom was coming to an end. As December 27th turned into December 28th, Celia prepared for what she knew would be her final night of freedom. The bloodhounds were less than a mile away, and she could hear the voices of her pursuers echoing through the winter forest. 3 days after the Christmas Eve massacre, Celia's desperate flight was nearing its end. She had proven that even the most oppressed person could strike back against their oppressors, but she had also learned that individual resistance, no matter how violent or complete, could not overcome the massive power of the slave system. The 19-year-old woman who had killed 4 people in her fight for freedom was about to face the full fury of a system that would never forgive her for daring to claim the most basic human right, the right to control her own body. December 28, 1855, dawn. The bloodhounds found Celia's hiding place along Avoz Creek as the first light of morning broke through the Missouri winter sky. 3 days of freedom, the only freedom she had known since Robert Newsom purchased her 5 years earlier, came to an end when Sheriff William Jones and his posse surrounded the cave where she had sought refuge. Celia emerged from the cave voluntarily, understanding that resistance would only bring more violence upon herself and potentially upon other enslaved people in the region. Her pregnancy was advanced, and the 3 days of flight through winter weather had exhausted her physical reserves. The sight of the 19-year-old pregnant woman who had terrorized white Missouri shocked even the hardened men who had been hunting her. This was not the dangerous criminal they had imagined, but a young woman who looked more like a victim than a killer. But the evidence of her crimes was undeniable. Bloodstains on her clothing and her absence from the Newsom farm during the time of the murders provided clear proof of her guilt. More importantly, several enslaved people from neighboring farms had seen her fleeing the scene on Christmas morning. Under interrogation at the Callaway County Jail, Celia initially maintained her innocence, claiming that she had fled the Newsom farm because she feared being blamed for murders committed by unknown intruders. But physical evidence and witness testimony made her denials increasingly implausible. After 2 days of questioning, Celia finally confessed to killing Robert Newsom and his 3 children. But her confession revealed aspects of the case that complicated the simple narrative of slave rebellion that white authorities preferred. Celia detailed the 5 years of sexual abuse she had endured at Robert Newsom's hands, describing how she had been purchased specifically for his sexual pleasure and how she had been forced to bear 2 children by her rapist. Her confession transformed the case from a simple story of murder into a complex tale of resistance against systematic sexual violence. The revelation that Robert Newsom had been raping Celia for 5 years created legal and moral complications that Missouri authorities had not anticipated. While Missouri law did not recognize rape of enslaved women as a crime, public sympathy for Celia's situation began to emerge among some segments of the white population. Celia's case presented unprecedented legal questions that Missouri courts were ill-equipped to handle. The state's legal system was built on the assumption that enslaved people were property rather than persons, but Celia's claims of self-defense forced courts to consider whether property could have rights. Judge William Hall, who presided over Celia's case, faced a legal dilemma that had no clear precedent in Missouri law. If Celia had the right to defend herself against rape, then her killing of Robert Newsom might be justified. But recognizing such a right would fundamentally undermine the legal basis of slavery itself. The case attracted attention from abolitionists throughout the North, who saw Celia's story as powerful evidence of slavery's inherent brutality. Newspaper coverage of the trial brought national attention to the legal and moral questions raised by her case. Defense attorney John Jameson accepted the case despite enormous social pressure and threats against his safety. Jameson argued that Missouri law recognized the right of any person to use deadly force to prevent rape, and that this protection should extend to enslaved women as well as free women. Prosecutor Robert Pruitt built his case on the simple fact that Celia had deliberately killed 4 white people, arguing that her motives were irrelevant under Missouri law. In his view, enslaved people had no right to resist their masters regardless of the treatment they received. Pruitt characterized Celia as a dangerous criminal whose actions threatened the safety of every white family in Missouri. He argued that showing any mercy to Celia would encourage other enslaved people to commit similar acts of violence. The prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of Celia's crimes, noting that she had killed not just Robert Newsom but his entire family, including his daughter Virginia, who had not been directly involved in her abuse. Most damaging to Celia's case was the systematic nature of the killings, which suggested that this was not a moment of passionate self-defense but a calculated act of revenge that went far beyond what could be justified even under the most liberal interpretation of self-defense law. The trial lasted 3 days, during which testimony revealed the full extent of the abuse Celia had suffered and the desperate circumstances that had driven her to murder. Public opinion was divided, with some expressing sympathy for her situation, while others demanded her execution as an example to other enslaved people. The all-white male jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Judge Hall sentenced Celia to death by hanging, to be carried out on January 15, 1856. The speed of the verdict reflected the jury's understanding that sympathy for Celia's situation could not overcome the legal and social necessity of maintaining the slave system. Allowing an enslaved person to kill white people, regardless of the provocation, would set a precedent that could undermine the entire institution of slavery. Celia received the news of her sentence with the same stoic dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. She understood that her fate had been determined not by the facts of her case, but by the legal and social system that defined her as property rather than a person. Defense attorney Jameson immediately filed an appeal with the Missouri Supreme Court, arguing that the trial court had erred in refusing to instruct the jury on the law of self-defense as it applied to enslaved women. The appeal focused on the fundamental question of whether enslaved people had any legal rights that courts were bound to respect. The Missouri Supreme Court's handling of Celia's appeal would test the state's commitment to its own legal principles. If Missouri law truly provided equal protection under the law, then Celia's right to defend herself against rape should be recognized regardless of her status as an enslaved person. Celia's trial forced America to confront the fundamental contradictions of a legal system that claimed to protect all citizens while denying basic rights to millions. If this story is opening your eyes to the complexities of American history, please share it and subscribe for more untold stories that shaped our nation. As Celia awaited the outcome of her appeal in the Callaway County Jail, she represented something unprecedented in American legal history, an enslaved person whose case had forced courts to grapple with a fundamental question of whether property could have rights. Her story had already achieved something remarkable by bringing national attention to the systematic sexual abuse that was endemic to the slave system. But whether that attention would translate into legal protection for enslaved women remained to be seen. The final chapter of Celia's story would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of millions of other enslaved people who suffered similar abuse with no legal recourse. The Missouri Supreme Court's decision would either recognize the basic human rights of enslaved people or reaffirm their status as property subject to any treatment their masters chose to impose. January 12, 1856. 3 days before Celia's scheduled execution, the Missouri Supreme Court delivered its decision on her appeal. In a unanimous ruling that would become infamous in legal history, the court upheld her conviction and death sentence, ruling that enslaved people had no right to resist their masters under any circumstances. Justice William Scott, writing for the court, argued that recognizing Celia's right to self-defense would render the subordination of the slave illusory and undermine the entire legal foundation of slavery. The court explicitly rejected the argument that Missouri's laws protecting women from rape applied to enslaved women. The decision reflected the legal system's commitment to maintaining slavery, even when that commitment required denying the most basic human rights. The court acknowledged that Celia had been systematically raped but ruled that such treatment was within Robert Newsom's legal rights as her owner. The Supreme Court's ruling sent a clear message to enslaved people throughout Missouri: no level of abuse justified resistance against white authority. The law would protect masters' property rights even when those rights included the right to rape and brutalize human beings. With her legal appeals exhausted, Celia spent her final days in the Callaway County Jail preparing for death. She was now in the final weeks of her pregnancy, carrying the child of the man she had killed in self-defense. Prison officials faced the unusual problem of executing a pregnant woman, leading to debates about whether the execution should be postponed until after she gave birth. Missouri law prohibited the execution of pregnant women, but authorities were reluctant to delay Celia's death sentence. During her final days, Celia was visited by several ministers who attempted to convince her to repent for her crimes. These conversations revealed Celia's continued belief that she had been justified in defending herself against rape, even though the law disagreed. Celia's case had attracted attention from abolitionists throughout the North, who organized petition drives calling for commutation of her death sentence. These efforts brought national attention to her story but had little impact on Missouri authorities, who were determined to make an example of her. On January 10, 1856, just 5 days before her scheduled execution, Celia gave birth to a son, the child of Robert Newsom, conceived through rape but born in the shadow of the gallows. The birth temporarily postponed the execution, as Missouri law prohibited killing pregnant women. The child represented the tragic complexity of Celia's story, a living symbol of the sexual violence that had driven her to murder, but also an innocent life whose fate was tied to his mother's crimes. Local authorities arranged for the child to be sold into slavery, ensuring that Robert Newsom's final act of rape would continue to generate profit even after his death. On January 15, 1856, exactly 1 month after the Christmas Eve massacre, Celia was led to the gallows erected in the courthouse square of Fulton, Missouri. More than 2,000 people gathered to witness the execution of the woman who had dared to fight back against her oppressor. Celia walked to the gallows with the same dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. Her final words, reported by several newspapers, were a simple statement: "I done what I had to do." She maintained to the end that her actions had been justified, even though the law disagreed. At 1 p.m. on January 15, 1856, Celia was hanged before the largest crowd in Callaway County history. Her death was intended to serve as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of resistance, but it also became a powerful symbol for abolitionists who pointed to her case as evidence of slavery's fundamental brutality. The execution was carried out with clinical efficiency, reflecting the legal system's determination to close the case quickly and prevent further discussion of the uncomfortable questions it had raised. Celia died without ever receiving legal recognition of her right to defend herself against rape. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the county potter's field, denied even the dignity of a proper burial. The authorities' desire to erase Celia from history reflected their understanding that her story posed a fundamental challenge to the moral legitimacy of slavery. Celia's case became a powerful tool for abolitionists who used her story to illustrate the systematic sexual violence that was endemic to slavery. Her willingness to risk death rather than submit to continued rape provided a compelling narrative of resistance that resonated with Northern audiences. The legal precedent established by her case, that enslaved people had no right to self-defense against their masters, remained in effect throughout the South until the Civil War ended slavery. Celia's death sentence thus became part of the legal foundation that maintained slavery through violence and terror. Her story also influenced the broader debate about women's rights in antebellum America. While white women had limited legal protections against rape, Celia's case demonstrated that enslaved women had no protections at all, highlighting the intersection of racial and gender oppression in American society. Modern historians recognize Celia's case as a crucial example of enslaved women's resistance to sexual violence, challenging earlier historical narratives that portrayed enslaved people as passive victims. Her willingness to fight back, even at the cost of her life, demonstrated the agency that enslaved people maintained even under the most oppressive circumstances. Celia's story also reveals the systematic nature of sexual violence under slavery, challenging romanticized narratives about the antebellum South. Her case provides documented evidence of the rape and abuse that millions of enslaved women suffered with no legal recourse. Perhaps most importantly, Celia's resistance exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American slavery. a system that claimed to be based on law and order while denying basic legal protections to millions of people. The story of Celia of Missouri remains one of the most powerful examples of individual resistance against systematic oppression in American history. Her decision to fight back against sexual violence, knowing that it would likely cost her life, demonstrates extraordinary courage and moral clarity. Celia's case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, resistance, and the price of freedom. Her willingness to kill rather than submit to continued rape challenges simple narratives about violence and nonviolence in the struggle against oppression. Today, Celia is remembered not as a criminal, but as a symbol of resistance against injustice. Her story continues to inspire those who fight against sexual violence and systemic oppression, reminding us that the struggle for human dignity sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. The unmarked grave where Celia was buried has never been found, but her story lives on as a testament to the courage of those who refuse to accept injustice, even when the law provides no protection and resistance means death. In the end, Celia achieved something that the law denied her: recognition as a human being whose life had meaning and whose resistance had value. Her story reminds us that justice is not always found in courtrooms, and that sometimes the most important victories are moral rather than legal. Celia of Missouri died as she had lived, fighting for the right to control her own body and her own destiny. Her legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept oppression, and in every law that now protects the vulnerable from those who would abuse their power.